His teacher never paid him much attention, never called his name, never asked for his thoughts, until the day she did. And it wasn't just any day. It was the day she decided to humiliate him, right there in front of everyone. But when he started to play, the look on her face said it all. She never saw it coming. Elijah Rivers sat near the window, his pencil tapping rhythmically against the edge of his notebook. It wasn't because he was anxious. No, this was just a habit. One his mother had been nagging him to break for years. But what could he say? Helped him think. The classroom at Jefferson Middle School in Little Rock, Arkansas, buzzed with its usual morning energy. Whispers, laughter, chairs scraping against the floor. The kind of noise that always filled the room before the lesson began. But Elijah wasn't paying attention to any of that. His focus was locked on the worksheet in front of him. He liked getting things done early, finishing before anyone else. It made things easier. At the front of the room, Miss Abigail Thornton stood with her usual air of authority, skimming through her notes. She had been teaching 6th grade for nearly 15 years, and in that time she had built herself a reputation. Fair. At least that's what her favorite students would say. Elijah had never been one of them. It wasn't obvious. She didn't yell at him, didn't make rude remarks, didn't call him out in front of the class. At least, not in the way she did with others. But he noticed, and so did a few of his classmates. She barely ever called on him, even when his hand was raised. If he got an answer right, she moved on without a second thought. But if he ever, on the rarest occasion, got something wrong, she lingered. She let the silence stretch, almost as if she enjoyed the moment. Elijah wasn't the only one who saw it. Yo, she barely even looks at you. Tyler Whitman, the boy sitting next to him, leaned in and whispered one afternoon. You got like teacher invisibility or something. Elijah had only shrugged. Guess I do. But today was different. He could feel it. Miss Thornton's eyes drifted toward him more than usual, not in a way that signaled trouble, but in a way that felt expectant. And then it happened. Elijah, she said, her voice crisp and sharp. Why don't you answer this one? The room shifted. Heads turned. Elijah blinked, caught off guard. She never called on him. Ever. He sat up straighter, scanning the board for the question. His mind moved quickly, processing, analyzing. He cleared his throat. General Sherman's March to the Sea was a military campaign designed to break the Confederacy's resources and morale. Miss Thornton tilted her head slightly. She murmured. Not bad. Not bad at all. A few students exchanged glances. Tyler shot him a look that said, "What was that about?" The lesson carried on. But something had shifted. For the first time in a long time, Miss Thornton wasn't ignoring him. She was watching him. And then, just before the bell rang, she made her move. "Elijah," she said as students began packing up. "Stay behind for a moment." A few heads turned. A few curious glances were exchanged. But no one said anything. Elijah took his time gathering his things before walking up to her desk. She folded her hands together, watching him carefully. "I overheard you talking the other day." His brows furrowed. "About what?" "Your grandfather." Something about her tone made the air feel heavier. "You mentioned he was a musician," she continued, tilting her head. "A pianist, correct?" Elijah hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. He played jazz." A small smile tugged at her lips, but there was no warmth in it. "Interesting." She leaned back slightly, tapping her fingers against the desk. "Then I assume you must have picked up a thing or two." Elijah didn't answer right away. Something about this conversation felt off. "A little," he admitted. Her smile widened. But it wasn't a kind smile. "Good to know." The bell rang. Elijah grabbed his bag and turned toward the door. But her voice stopped him. "Tomorrow," she said smoothly. "Let's see what you've got." He turned back. "What?" She gestured toward the old, upright piano in the corner of the room. The one no one ever touched. "You'll play something for the class." Elijah stared at her, his body still, his mind racing. The room was nearly empty now, but a few students had paused near the doorway, lingering just long enough to hear. Their eyes flicked between him and Miss Thornton. "Why?" he asked. Miss Thornton tilted her head, amused. "Why not? You said your grandfather played. I'm sure you have some of that talent in you." Elijah knew that tone. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't encouragement. It was a setup. She expected him to fail. She wanted him to fail. But he wasn't about to give her the satisfaction. That night, Elijah barely slept. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in his head. Over and over. This wasn't just a request. It was a challenge. And he knew exactly what kind. She thought he'd stumble. She thought he'd embarrass himself. She thought she could prove whatever opinion she had already formed about him. But she didn't know the full story. And tomorrow she was going to learn. The next morning, Elijah walked into the classroom feeling a weight settle over him. Word had traveled fast. Whispers followed him. "You gonna play today?" Brandon Hall smirked from across the room. Elijah didn't answer. "Didn't know you were a piano guy," Tyler murmured. Elijah kept his eyes on his notebook. "There's a lot people don't know." Miss Thornton entered, setting her books down with an air of satisfaction. She barely acknowledged the students settling in. Her focus was on him. The first half of class dragged on, but Elijah barely heard any of it. His mind was locked on one thing, waiting for the moment she would call on him. And then she did. "Well," she said, closing her book. "We have a little time before the next lesson." "Perfect." She turned toward the piano. "Elijah, let's see what you can do." The energy in the room shifted. Some students whispered. Some just watched. Elijah stood. A few muffled laughs rippled through the class. Someone muttered something, but he didn't need to hear the words. He knew the tone. Miss Thornton clasped her hands together. "Play whatever you'd like." Elijah walked to the piano, ran his fingers over the keys. They were old, slightly yellowed, a little out of tune. He inhaled, exhaled, and then he played. And from the very first note, the room fell silent. Because in that moment they all realized. This wasn't what they were expecting. Up and down the keyboard, Elijah's fingers moved with precision, dancing effortlessly over the keys. A progression his grandfather had taught him. One that had frustrated him for months. So many nights spent fumbling through the notes, getting it wrong over and over again until one day, he didn't. Now it was second nature. His left hand laid down a deep, rolling bass line, steady and commanding, while his right hand soared over it, weaving a melody so rich and intricate that it felt like it was telling a story. A story of struggle. A story of determination. A story none of them had expected to hear. The notes collided and resolved in perfect harmony, filling the classroom with a sound so powerful, so undeniable, that it left no room for laughter, no space for doubt. And the longer he played, the heavier the silence became. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was something else, something weighty, something thick, something that wrapped around every single person in that room and held them in place. Like the very notes filling the air, it settled over them, pressed into their chests, made them feel something they hadn't been prepared for. No one laughed now. Tyler, who usually had a sarcastic remark for everything, leaned forward slightly in his seat. His eyes wide with something that looked a lot like shock. Brandon, who had cracked a joke earlier, still had his arms crossed, but his smirk. Instead, his brows were furrowed. His lips slightly parted, as if he was trying to process what he was hearing. A few students exchanged glances, their faces shifting from surprise to something else, something that almost looked like admiration. And then the crescendo. Elijah's fingers pressed firmly against the keys, striking chords that echoed against the walls, filling every inch of the space with something bigger than just music. The sound swelled, rushed forward, climbed higher, louder, richer. Every quiet space where doubt had once lived was now drowning in something else, something undeniable, something impossible to ignore. He pushed harder, let the final run carry the weight of every unspoken word, every assumption, every expectation. Silence. The last note rang out, lingering for just a second before fading into nothing. Elijah lifted his hands slowly, letting them rest in his lap. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For a moment, it was as if the entire room had been frozen in time, suspended in the aftermath of what had just happened. And then, single clap. It came from the back of the room. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire class erupted into applause. Tyler let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. Damn! Brandon, still sitting with his arms crossed, exhaled sharply. He shook his head, almost like he was annoyed with himself for being impressed. I didn't know he could do that, he muttered under his breath. Elijah inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly. His heart was pounding, but not from nerves. It was something else. Something electric. He hadn't just played the piano. He had changed something. The applause swelled. Students looking at each other like they had just witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. Something they wouldn't forget. But through all the noise, all the energy filling the room, the loudest silence of all came from Miss Thornton. She stood by her desk, arms still crossed, lips pressed into a firm, unreadable line. The applause echoed around her, yet she hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't reacted. Elijah sat still, hands resting in his lap, his breathing calm, steady. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't looking for approval. He just let the moment sit. Let them all sit with it.